Good morning. I'm Monica Dressler. I'm Director of LSA Instructional Support Services, and I want to welcome you to what really is one of my favorite events for some of my favorite projects that LS&A is involved in. The work that the Language Resource Center and LS&A Instructional Support Services are doing, not only for LS&A, but working on in global engagements throughout different schools and programs, is really provides exceptional opportunities for students. Not only is it that opportunity to learn more, explore, and engage with different cultures and really engage in their content of their courses in new ways. But at the heart of it is really that opportunity for students to learn that with some very basic technologies that they can experience and a lot more than what a normal class might do. And moreover, that they can transcend the four walls of a classroom. And that classroom experience can then become that bridge to international experiences. And so, like I said, it really is some of that engagement and active learning that really is exceptional at the University of Michigan. The format that we're going to do for today's or this morning's session will be each of our speakers will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some questions immediately for that speaker after each person has a chance to talk. I think Greg and Suzanne and Kelly will be here for lunch, but for getting sound in and out, so I will try to stand as still as possible. How's that? Not to move. We also have guests participating, I believe by Blue Jeans, or that they will be, so at some point, hopefully that they will be able to participate. Anyone who is joining us from afar, you'll be able to text in your questions, and then those will get passed along to our moderator. So if you are participating that way, we're very glad that you're able to do that. Our first speaker is Josh Miller. He's Associate Professor of English Language and Literature and Judaic Studies in LS&A. And the course that he's going to talk about is an English 400 level course. It's 472. It's called Immigrant Narratives. And he's partnering with Ben Gurion University in Israel. So, Josh, you want to?
Thanks. Do you want me to speak up there, or?
Whichever works.
Can you? Some in the back might not be able to see me, so maybe I should. What do you all prefer? You want me to stand up there? Okay. Can everybody see, hear? Probably those are the only senses that are relevant. Okay, so hi everybody. Thanks for responding. My name is Josh Miller, as Woody said. I'm not wearing a scarf. But I'm sure there's another patriarchal reason why I can't be heard. So I have not prepared a lengthy speech or talk. What I hope is that we can sort of start a dialogue, and that dialogue can be one that starts now, frankly. So in all of my classes, one of the things I tell my students on the first day, which they do not believe, but you should believe me because we're teachers together, is that I prefer to be interrupted. I'm a New Yorker. I assume that interruption is interest, not, stultifying boredom on your end. So please ask me questions as I talk. I'm sort of taking that for granted, that you'll be able to do that. Hopefully respectfully, but I'll take disrespectful questions as well. Feel free to just sort of jump in at any point here. So I want to talk a little bit about my course that I taught with Catherine in 2015, and it's kind of an ongoing project. Whoops, I think I might be doing something here. Did I do anything wrong?
No.
Oh. I think I messed up the keys over here. This is how not to teach. You're doing great. Let's see what happens. So the basic idea here is that I started off with the idea that having discovered sort of mid-career that I work best in collaboration, and I work least well in isolation. I've come to see that I teach best in dialogue with other faculty members. I research and edit best in collaboration with colleagues. So I've just come to sort of discover, kind of out of nowhere, frankly, it was a little bit surprising to me, how productive these kinds of activities have become for me. And so I've really sort of become someone who's pursued those possibilities wherever they lie. The other thing that I've discovered, which I did not anticipate, is that teaching abroad has been enormously illuminating for me as somebody who teaching American literature. That's not necessarily an obvious sort of possibility. My approach is comparative and transnational, and so there are all sorts of opportunities for thinking internationally about my subject matter. And the nice thing about these global seminars with video conferencing when they arose, and when I first saw the email that sort of indicated that there was support on campus for this, was that I was able to do both of those things at once. Teach collaboratively with a respected colleague, and also to teach essentially a kind of study abroad class without leaving Ann Arbor. So it seemed like the best of all worlds, and frankly it was. My initial version of it, which dates the project a bit, was to teach it with actually 2 collaborators and to do a class in a Palestinian university, a class at an Israeli university that was chosen because it was particularly multi-ethnic region of Israel, and to teach American literature of immigration, with an idea that each of the student groups would have quite remarkably varied interpretations and perceptions and insights about the same text. And the idea was to create a kind of cubist conversation in which Palestinian students and Jewish Israeli students, non-Jewish Israeli students, and American students of all kinds could sort of participate from their own perspectives on this body of literature. That for a variety of reasons, institutional, political, and historical, that tripartite system did not work out. So I was sort of left choosing one partner, and the Palestinian universities were a little bit more difficult to organize, so I started with the Israeli partner, Catherine Rottenberg, and I at Ben Gurion University set this up. And I can talk a little bit about some of the challenges, but I also want to talk about why I chose the particular class that I chose to do this with, because it was not necessarily intuitive. It was not the class that enrolled the largest. It was not the class that was my favorite necessarily to teach. It did happen to be a class that I'm researching. It's the subject of my book that I'm hoping to finish one of these years. But it was a class actually that I had some challenges teaching, because immigrant narratives are the kinds of topics that students as well as colleagues, frankly, automatically think they know what that is and think they can't learn what they are. And so I'm going to publish this book that I hope will change that. But in the meantime, everybody kind of clouds over when they hear me start talking about early 20th century immigrant narratives. People just start snoring immediately. Even people who are predisposed to be interested in the topic. And so it actually has become this very creative site for me of trying to persuade students that there's something really valuable here, that they will gain knowledge that they would otherwise not have. And it's become, as a productive challenge, also a class that is reliably enrolled, but enrolled in relatively small numbers. And one of the things that I wanted for this class was to have a class that was engaged, informed, students who care about the material, but not a gigantic class. And some of my classes get quite large. So it enrolled exactly at the right size that I hoped. Catherine and I started working together, I think about a year and a half in advance. And I don't think that's required, but Todd and Philomena, and I'm going to make a parenthetical plea here, which is to say if you're working with Todd and Philomena, let me just say now that I think I speak on behalf of everybody who has ever worked with them when I say listen to what they suggest. They are geniuses. And the particular proposal that they may have for a problem that you do not see coming may not be the exact solution that you end up using. But I guarantee you some iteration of that suggestion, to your chagrin, when you initially laugh it off, will be the thing that you do. So listen to them. So the main thing I would say is that I found it very productive to start early. I found it productive to work with a colleague I really respected. I have no idea if Catherine respects me, but it seemed like she did. She made a good face of performing that she did. And that kind of preparation and mutuality, I think, was one of the keys to working out as well as it did. Because what we were able to do is to essentially figure out what to script and what to improv. And this goes to one of the challenges, which is teaching styles, after a while, I think it's safe to say, get kind of ingrained in us. We sort of develop our own strengths and skills. We, sort of start to rely on them and kind of, perfect them and use them. When you're collaborating and teaching, especially with somebody across a digital divide, there's a tremendous amount of compromise that needs to take place. And Catherine and I were very open about what we understood to be our sort of strengths and weaknesses as pedagogically. And so I'm kind of an improv person. I improv within an existing structure, but I do prefer, for the most part, to sort of let a certain degree of the classroom interaction sort of take shape in the moment. Like now, don't forget I asked you to ask questions. Whereas Catherine is more of a scripter, kind of planner. And so we figured out a way to do both. We scripted things and then we kind of changed things in the process. I'm not going to say much about the class itself. I'm not going to talk to you about the materials of it, although I'm happy to talk about those if you're interested. The main thing I would say is that I found it helpful at all points to centralize what I understood to be the needs of my students and Catherine's students. So when questions would come up, that was basically our kind of guiding principle, was to say, will this benefit the classroom environment for both groups? Will it help the students get to the objectives that we see as our aims? Or will in some way, will it hinder those? And we found in many cases that we could make a lot of decisions pretty quickly on that basis. And so the preparation for it led us to really prioritize things like cross-cultural interaction. This process offers the opportunity of diversity exponentially multiplied. The perspectival opportunities that students have in these kinds of confines are kind of limitless. So we started off pretty early on deciding that we wanted to work out a sort of three-part structure to our classes. The way it worked is we would start off, and in most cases, because the material was US narratives, and because our semester started earlier, and so my students had already had kind of a running head start in some ways, creating a community, learning the texts, figuring me out, those kinds of things. And Catherine's class was starting later in our semester. Catherine and I decided that she should sort of be a little bit more central in setting up some of the key course concepts. So she introduced the class the first two times we met. When we did mini lectures to contextualize things, she would start off and I would chime in. We sort of worked out a script, a bit of scripting so that we knew who was going to do what, when exactly. And that was helpful too, because I will also say parenthetically that while Blue Jeans technology is awesome, it is frankly astonishingly good and offers opportunities for kind of getting a sense of individual students, facial expressions, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Even the eye rolls are okay. And sort of a certain kind of, I wouldn't say intimacy, but at least knowledge of who's out there, what interests them and what doesn't. It will also produce challenges. It's just kind of guaranteed. I think Murphy's Law was created for video conferencing. And so for that reason, I would kind of urge you also to just plan flexibility into the process, because unexpected interruptions and slowdowns will take place. So Catherine introduced things. I would do the mini lectures for the next couple classes, and she did the mini lectures for the last few. And then we would have a kind of group-to-group, full-out, two-class, everybody in the room, in the digital room and in the actual room conversation. And what happened accidentally, but it turned out to be a very useful pedagogical skill, I think Catherine did this first and I sort of followed, is we started calling on each other's students by name after the first class when we got to know each other's names. And I could see in my students' posture the recognition and the benefit, the sort of boost that created when Catherine remembered, because she has an incredible memory, unlike me, she would remember from class to class what a student had said previously, and she would say things like, oh, that's really interesting that you would say that. I remember a class or two ago you were talking about this other topic. And so if you can figure out a way to create familiarity across the digital divide, that's something that I think really kind of paid off. The other thing that I think was incredibly beneficial in terms of our pedagogy was to just really work hard to make sure we got off on the right foot initially. How this entire enterprise begins is pretty important. I don't mean to raise the stakes and terrify you. What I mean to say is that if the first conversation or two, which will have technical glitches, but if it can be one that's really generating goodwill and a sense of the generosity on all sides, that goes a long way, and that sticks with, in my experience, the undergraduates, or probably graduate students too, who are involved because they really sort of remember that that was kind of the goal of the process, and it gets structured into the system as well. So just to sort of finish up this thing I keep digressing from, our structure was, yeah?
Just a quick question. So just to clarify, everything was in English then? So the students in Israel also spoke English?
It was, and actually in my challenges, oh sure, thanks. The question was whether or not the class was held in English, the readings were in English, and whether that was kind of a part of the structure. And the answer is unfortunately yes. And one of the challenges that came up during the during the process is there was a bit of a power imbalance that Catherine and I had to take into account, because the students that were not U.S. students were in many cases not only not first English speakers as their first language, at times English was their third or fourth or fifth language. Their knowledge of it was remarkable in most cases, but never perfect. And their knowledge of, say, terminological jargon that I might be able to throw at Michigan undergrads would not necessarily be as clear to them as it would be to us. And so there were lots and lots of times where I had to slow down, and Catherine and I would sort of remind each other, sometimes even just waving, saying like, slow down, you just said 9 things that my students didn't understand, or things like that. So that, yeah, that was, that's a big, language is a huge opportunity and challenge. Okay, so I'll finish this thing that, unless you guys have more questions, because I clearly like digressing. The structure was mini lecture and introductions, full group conversation with both classes participating, and we didn't have any sort of calculus or algorithm for figuring out how long that would go on exactly, but we tried to ensure that the center of gravity was sort of met, in which students on both sides spoke. We felt as though we'd gotten through a certain amount of the introductory material that we wanted to. Then we would do breakout sessions, which I frankly did not anticipate going nearly as well. It was just one of those things that Todd and Philomena mentioned, and I said, oh, okay, sure, maybe we'll try that once. And it was incredibly valuable and productive. So what we did, yeah.
I'm sorry, the whole group, you said you sort of right-sized the class, but how many students?
Total were on both sides.
Great question. Let me do the math. There were probably 12 on my side, and I would say about 15 on the other side. Yeah, so not one-to-one. That was actually important for the breakout sessions, because very frequently we had uneven numbers. And a lot of her students were commuting. Many of them were older. Some of them had families. Some of them had jobs. The time zone difference was a challenge. The semester schedules was a challenge. There are, as I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you, challenges aplenty here. It's really worth it. I'm going to do this again at the first opportunity I have to figure out a way, because the payoff is just so extraordinary. But there's definitely a lot to take into account. All right, let's see if I finish this before dinner time. So the breakout sessions would be directed in the same way that small group work does happen in our classes normally. So when I do small group work in my classes, I give each group either all the same directive, and I give them the opportunity to sort of do different things with it, so look at different passages or chapters or different texts, or I let the groups come up with their own topic within a range of ideas. And so I'll give them a set of options, and I'll say you can pick from these 3 or these 5 choices. And I kind of go around the room to make sure that each of the group is doing something different. So in this case, we had to modify it and do a bit more scripting, because that more improv-like version of it would have been much more time consuming, and we needed to maximize what we could accomplish in the time that we had. So in those cases, we would often, by name, sometimes pair students up. So it wasn't a free-for-all. It was a you sit here, and you sit here, and you sit here, and now talk. And it wasn't nearly as authoritarian as it sounds, but they needed that kind of direction to sort of get going. And then once they did, yeah, Samantha.
How did you?
Need to turn.
How did you work the technology for those groups? Because that's something that we also tried and didn't work.
Oh.
Because the student groups, their computers didn't have the right blue jeans. You know, half of them were talking to each other, the other half weren't, and it ended up not working.
Yeah. Todd has a few scars from our experience, I think it's safe to say, especially from his sprinting across the classroom to try to fix some of the things that would come up. We had the benefit of the fact that all of the students in this particular class had either cell phones that they could do blue jeans on, or laptops of some kind, or borrowed laptops that the class that Catherine was able to borrow and get her. They were doing a digital initiative, so they were able to upgrade their technology a bit with our help. And then I actually happened to be doing research in the neighborhood the summer before, so I actually got Todd and Philomena gave me, I don't know if I should be saying this actually. I don't think I broke any international laws by doing this, but is this okay to say? I brought over some microphones and headsets and handed them to Catherine. And whatever we need to do legally to get it back, we did. And that they used those microphones, and what we ended up doing was figuring out a way for them to have either one-on-one, kind of like single conversations one-on-one, or often it was sort of two-to-two groups. And with a fair amount of elbow grease, we did make those ultimately work, but there were all kinds of problems with slow Wi-Fi on their side, with machines that didn't kind of act up, that did act up or didn't work. Pretty much every class session had some new and unique technical problem. But the good news is we were able to get them ultimately working. It's just that some of them were a little bit slower than others. The feedback, sometimes they would hear feedback loops basically of sound. The video would be fine, so they'd be doing sign language to each other. I mean, this is the part about it that was sort of endearing actually, is that the students were dedicated enough to making this work, that if the sound was working, they would talk without video. If the video was working, they would mime things and sort of pantomime and do kind of creative gestures. They were game for kind of figuring out a way to make it work. And we kind of gave them tasks. We kind of gave them little challenges. So we would say, you've got 5 minutes to do this impossible task that should really take you an hour. Go. And they would just sort of go off and running and try to accomplish it. And then the last part of the session, I did finish. Last part of the session was a regrouping of both classes in full sets of both classes, and each group would present what they discussed, and as the presentations would occur kind of one by one, very frequently they would build on one another kind of accidentally. So they would start referencing other presentations, and they would say, like the other group, we talked about selfhood or nationalism or whatever, and then gender and sexuality or something along those lines, and then they would kind of riff in their own direction. So there was a nice kind of building process that would kind of happen to a certain extent based on the architecture of the assignments. I actually didn't look and see what time we started, so I don't know what time. Are we good?
Since you've been interspersing questions there, give you a little time.
Oh, okay. Well, let me see. Are there any more questions? Yeah.
So I'm just interested, since you said that the class is about insert narratives and multi-ethnic societies.
Can we wait on questions? We need to get mics.
I'm just interested if in the future this class of immigrant memories and multi-ethnic societies, would you consider having a partner in another region of the world, another country, just kind of, big refugee crisis in Europe, working with maybe German partners or Italian, or even in the Balkans, in Bosnia, where they're still grappling with the kind of multi-ethnic society and divisions that persist. Would that be of interest, and would you reach out to?
For sure, yeah. The place where I've taught for the last 2 times I've done study abroad programs was in Rome. So Italian partners were my planned next stop. And especially if the Palestinian option doesn't work out, that would be where I would head next. But yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where I think the class that Catherine and I taught was in 2015, I believe. We started planning in probably 2013. So the pace of events with regard to migration issues has just gotten so transformed since then that it's kind of become a different set of possibilities. So yes, when I do it again, very likely I'll be doing it with somebody who's who can speak to and speak from and speak with, in some ways, the new kind of catastrophe. along those lines.
I have kind of a multi-part question about some of your logistics. So I'm wondering what percentage of your collaboration was synchronous? So did your classes meet at the same time? And if so, how did you all achieve that scheduling? And then was every class focused around communicating together? Or were there some classes where you just met with your own class separately? And then finally, did the students ever work together or communicate with each other outside of class, either casually or in an assigned way?
Man, those are good questions. Yes, no, and yes. I'll elaborate.
Short answers.
Right. The quick answers are, what was the first question?
First question is about what percentage of your collaboration was synchronous?
Oh, okay, so.
And then how did you schedule class time together, if that was a thing?
Yeah, it was a headache, frankly. So their semester started in October, which meant that we had about 6 weeks of class meetings entirely alone. And that, it wasn't ideal, and if it's all possible to synchronize more the start of the semesters, that is something that next time I do this, I'm going to try to make sure that that happens with more efficiency. The second thing is Catherine happened to be on an administrative assignment that meant that she could only teach 1 day a week. So even during the weeks when we started to meet, we had to meet, not by our preference, but by just the necessities of her schedule. We had to meet only once a week with them. If they were meeting twice a week, we would have met twice a week. It would have been much better that way. So unfortunately, a lot of the semester we were kind of on our own and having to figure out whether or not we could work with the other class offline, because we couldn't schedule additional meetings, but we could potentially do voluntary assignments offline, which is getting to, I think, question 3 of those two. So we met as much as we could. One of the things that, again, just to sort of continue the theme Todd and Philomena suggested, which was a real godsend, is they recommended that since we were starting earlier, that we do these little short cell phone introduction videos, which actually turned out to be incredibly sweet, because my students would often in their homes sort of do a little bit of like this FaceTime thing where they'd say, you know, here's my bed, and here's my desk, and here's where I study, and here's where they didn't know what the other students would be interested in. One student had a pig running around in her background because that was her pet. So it was all very interesting and very sort of personable. And those, we had planned for the other students to do the same thing, but for lack of time and I think shyness, they didn't. And also the language issues, I think, played in a little bit. So we were as synchronous as we could, but it wasn't enough. And if that's something I want to remedy next time. What was question 2?
Whether all of your classes were focused around communicating together, or
Yes.
if there were classes for you individually.
We did meet separately, but only, not by design.
Her classroom was scheduled at a time where
zones.
you all could meet at the same time. So you were in class during your scheduled class time, she was in class during her scheduled class time, and you did time zone math so that your classes were meeting concurrently.
This is why we started a year and a half in advance, right?
Because you have to get it in the system.
Exactly.
Yeah. How
Yeah.
amenable was the system to that request?
Well, I was, I think
You're
I
on
was,
the early end.
yeah, I had the good fortune of being, I think, my own director of undergraduate studies at the time, so I was my own boss, so I had to yell at myself occasionally, but I was able, I had a certain degree of system flexibility. My department was terrific through this whole process. I mean, everything that I asked for, they said yes to. So I will say, if there are any administrators out there in the audience or out there in digital land, this is really hard work on the instructors, so whatever understanding you can give them would be much appreciated.
So Josh won't be available for lunch, so I want to give time for one more question, just a little bit longer. So.
And for what it's worth, if you're not completely tired of hearing from me, I'm happy to talk with you guys individually afterwards. I'm really sorry I have to run to another panel at 12, but I'd be delighted to talk with you about this. I can talk about this stuff for all day. I really enjoyed the process.
Any other questions? Great, terrific.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Our second speaker is from the College of Engineering. Professor Greg Holder is in mechanical engineering and is going to share a little bit about a couple of different courses. The one is a really interesting preparatory course where it's an engineering across the cultures. And what I find really interesting and I'm eager to hear about is how a discipline with subject matter that isn't traditionally thought of as international can have this really critical international global component. And then he's also going to maybe share a little bit about an upcoming project that he's doing, ongoing with the students in Shanghai. So please welcome Greg Holbert.
So I'm out of the Office of International Programs for Engineering. So the work I'm actually going to be talking about today is a huge collaborative effort over multiple years. Let me just do a plug on here. Our goal is to send all undergraduate engineering students to get international experience. Not there, is that better? Is it on? I just got to get closer. All right. It's that distance thing. I'm not used to having the mic right in my face. So we want to get all of our students there, and I'll tell you how many will be there as we work on this. And trying to provide resources for faculty and students to actually make this happen. So there are three things I want to talk about, the two that Monica mentioned. And I want to start off with the International Minor for Engineers that was created, which led to actually some of these other activities that are ongoing. This slide is dated, you can tell by the graphic that happens to be on there. It really is a slide from 10 years ago. And it was when the International Programs and Engineering Office, I'll call it IPE for short, was created, and this was sort of the brainchild of Amy Conger, who's in the provost office, and her boss, James Holloway, who was associate dean for undergraduate ed at the time, and one of my colleagues, Volker Zeke, in mechanical engineering. So why did we create a minor? There were no minors in the College of Engineering 10 years ago. We didn't believe in them, or quite frankly, LS&A has so many that our students were taking advantage of what was offered here on Central. But we wanted to develop some mechanism to be able to get our engineering students abroad, because the number of engineering students that were going abroad was in the single digits, actually 4 to 5% here at Michigan, and that's pretty typical across the country. So how do you do that? You badge them. That was the idea. So we created the International Minor to give them something on their transcript that would recognize that they had this particular experience. And it really was filling a gap that was not being sort of met, at least for engineering students, by the LS&A minors. So this was put together 10 years ago, and it comprises really 4 components. One's a foreign language component. They have to have 4th semester college level language competency. They have to have international coursework, so it's great to be here and see some of the other courses that can help for our engineers to be able to take things to get international exposure. The course that I'll talk about is this Engineering Across Cultures class, which has transformed itself over the 10 years. And then finally, they have to get international experience, which has to be a minimum of 6 weeks in one country, contiguous. So they can't be backpacking across Europe, and they can't do it in 3-week chunks. And there's a deliberate mark on why that's said, and there's a whole lot of strategic reason for that, which I can happy to talk about afterwards. The label up there in the corner, by the way, this is the #1 minor in the College of Engineering. Up to about 3 years ago, it turned out to be the #1 minor in terms of the number of students across the whole campus, which is pretty amazing. And then Raw School came up with a business minor, and we're far outnumbered by that, which is okay, really meeting the engineering cohort. So the experience that's on here, it's not just study abroad. There are many of our students will say, we get enough study when we're on the Ann Arbor campus, we're not interested in that. So what are the other opportunities? There are internships abroad, and we now have a full-time staff person to help develop those. It can be research abroad, and we're helping develop programs at other universities. The picture that's shown there is with Aachen RWTH, and we're developing others. And it can be volunteer abroad, some of the on-campus groups or other things as well. And it can be individualized things. I'll meet with students and help, if they're not, doesn't fit one of these particular bins, structure something that makes sense for them that really is a transformative experience. So I want to talk about the course. This is the one required element of this. It's a 1 credit hour course. It meets for an hour and a half. We offer each semester, and sometimes in the summers I'll talk about. So, engineers, why does culture matter? We're very good in the College of Engineering to deal with technology and develop tools that engineers can use to solve engineering problems. We're less sort of focused on sort of people and the needs. We had a speaker in just yesterday for our class who's the CEO of Mahindra in North America, and he's worked for Ford, he's worked for Tesla. He's been in Japan, he's been in Brazil on assignments. And he articulated very well why an engineer needs to have global competencies. And it's not just because you're going to get deployed there, but these companies are multinational. If you don't have an appreciation for, it's hard to have a complete understanding, but appreciation for the cultural differences, as Josh was talking about, pauses, silence. That's a critical component in other cultures and not necessarily ours. You'll fail. And if you design products and you don't understand the market, you will fail. And I have glorious examples of failures that I like to present to the student for people who haven't thought about this, including fatal errors that have happened. So it does matter for our students, and so this course is designed to be able to give them an introduction to why does culture matter as an engineer and as a practicing engineer. What we'll do in here is we have some, the course has transformed over the last few years, certainly that I've been involved with it. We have some basic introduction to ethnography and using ethnography in design. They get to practice these methods, so the interaction, the class as it's taught is students on campus, this cohort, but they're required, we put them into teams, I assign them a country, and then the students are required to interview somebody who was from that country, typically or here on campus. Those of you that might fill in or be interested in acting as interviewees, do let me know. I'm always interested in adding some. The countries I've chosen are particular based on the interviewees I have and also some of my own personal and professional interest of countries that the students get assigned. So they'll interview them what they're looking for, what are the cultural drivers, what are the cultural underpinnings of that country or cohort of that country. And then they have to come up with a product, propose a product or service, and then tie that in with design requirements. So one of the good things about this class is it's highly interactive. The students are in groups of working, walking, using one of the flexible classrooms that we have on North Campus. And so they get to learn from each other. And that's equally as valuable, or really more valuable than the course content that we have. This is the example. I should have brought one. Put one up on here of one of the, we have a poster fair. This is a plug. If you're up on please come to North Campus on Wednesday, December 6th, the afternoon. There are 12 teams this semester. They'll have posters up, and this is an example of what's on there. So this one I really, really like because they're the cultural drivers. So what are aspects about how does Mexican culture, particularly here, Oaxaca, how do they conceive of time? What are some of the other elements of how do they consider gender uses? How do they deal with art? And they were thinking about doing water resources. So many of these things are global challenges. But what they really liked out of this team did a great job, is they found what they were doing here. There is a NGO in Oaxaca that's trying to develop water systems and are actually incorporating some of the ideas that they have thought about into their particular design. And they found out about that after they had sort of come up with these things. So this stuff isn't really just simply abstract. They're people. Fortunately, they're actually thinking about how to do that. So this is the end product out of that. This one, Egunon, those of you that know Basque region, so that's good morning. So this course has been exported. I had the opportunity to teach the course this past summer in San Sebastian. Looking forward to doing it again. It's a 2-week course. So in this particular case, the course actually tends to have an international audience. There were Michigan students, there were students from Australia, and as Rick Haas yesterday had sort of said, there are also California students, which in some sense is a different culture than the Midwest. Actually, the sense of the students from San Luis Obispo and the students from Australia had a lot more in common in terms of their out-of-class activities than the Michigan students, because they all sort of So they had a chance to actually interact in this particular way, and it was a great experience for me teaching and working actually and trying to look at how to develop this course in a different model. So what's happened? Here's the international minor numbers. So it started off, the first cohort there was around 15. We're up to just about 80. Actually, a steady state on this thing would be right around 100 to 115 because that's the maximum number of students in a calendar year that the Engine 260 course handles. That's a course I don't want to get much larger than 50 because it's interactive. And you've all had experience, and at some number, interactivity goes down as the class size increases, or at least my ability to manage it. So it's actually fairly steady growth. We have roughly around 250 to 300 students declared in the minor at a time. And probably the bigger thing, and the 2017 number is still in flux. But you can see what it started 10 years ago, where we had about 100 students doing study abroad, and that included Professor Zeke's very successful program that he set up at TU Berlin, which had 40 of those 100 students in the blue, that were over 900 students that we said had international experience abroad in college engineering. 27% of our students that graduated this last year had international experience. And those are unique students, by the way, so there are more trips that went out beyond that. So we're making it. Are we to the 100%? No, not at all. We still have a long way to go, and we're trying to work on developing things. And this is just a breakdown of things. It's really almost half and half academic study, and the other half of the students going and doing something else, which is great. Having other options for the students to do things is critically important. Those that want to have it go towards academic credit and work it into their degrees can do that. But students want to do lots of other things, and we want to be as flexible and provide as much opportunity and support for them as possible. Here's an example of that that's set up that I want to talk about. That's ongoing now. This started a year ago, so this part of the slides I'll show was based on what we did. This is in the College of Engineering, we have something called a Multidisciplinary Design program, which is truly an intercultural experience for our students. Because you're taking different students from different disciplines and students at different academic levels. I'm mentoring a team right now where 4 of the 5 students are graduate students, and there's a freshman on there. There's a huge cultural difference in the ways they interact, the skill sets that they bring. So it's been a really interesting year to supervise that one and try to manage expectations. It's worked out pretty well. So this is one where I wanted to think about taking this model, and engineering is a global enterprise. So I wanted to try to take this and give a global perspective to this. And the ability to do this, University of Michigan has a joint institute with Shanghai Jiao Tong University, which has been in place since 2006, and it's something I've been actively involved with over a number of years, including teaching there 1 year. So what's involved in this thing? Students are used to having a set curriculum, being tested and graded in a very regular way. There is a unique solution to what they're trying to do, at least in the College of Engineering. Evaluation is fairly simple. Your answers are right or wrong. The idea of this multidisciplinary design program is typically the sponsors in this particular case is General Motors, as it is this year. They're industrial clients. You're mixed with people that don't have your same backgrounds. And they're cross-cultural teams. So we have Chinese students at the Joint Institute and Michigan students, and they're evaluated on many, many different scales, both from the corporate sponsor as well as from the faculty. What's really good about this is it's an open-ended problem. So if we knew the solution to it, the sponsors wouldn't be supporting this, and I frankly wouldn't be interested in teaching it if I knew what the answer was to the problems they're solving. And I'll give the students a chance to talk about what they're doing. It's truly working across cultures. In this case, mechanical engineers and electrical engineers. It's Chinese culture and US culture. And probably the biggest thing, and probably most important, it's actually working with a multicultural, multinational corporation. There is no such thing as a homogeneous culture in industries. It just doesn't work that way. And so having the students get exposed to what GM China looked like and what GM Detroit looked like, and last year what GM Opel looked like, unfortunately, they don't get that opportunity this year. and trying to balance those cultural, intercultural elements amongst just the general motors culture was really illuminating, a great experience for the students. And they get to transform this stuff to practice. So we tell the students this is a first baby step. We give them a chance to fail. But they're not failing on a job on this sort of thing. So it's going to take them years of practice to do this. So the students, it's challenging, it's confusing. The students get really frustrated in this because we're not telling them the answer. Well, we couldn't even if we knew what it was. But it's ultimately rewarding. I'll let the students talk about that. And we are periodically asking the students to reflect on what they've done. So we're gathering data. The cohort last year was 15, this year it's 11. So it's a small set as we continue to roll out this program to see what are the students doing self-reflections of some instruments that we've helped create and more, to be able to assess what are the students learning in their cultural experience on this. And I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the timeline. So the way this is set up, the Michigan students go to the Joint Institute in September. The students right now, we have 5 Michigan students participating with 6 Chinese students for this fall semester. So they're embedded together. They work together, they take classes together, they socialize together. Over the autumn festival, the Michigan students went to the Chinese students' homes. It's part of what we build in here. They get an experience, actually, that I've never had a chance to get. So they really get to work together and socialize together. We break them apart, so all the technical challenges we talked about, when Josh was talking about it, happen because now they still have to meet every week, and they have to meet actually outside of the meetings. They meet with me once a week, and we're doing it remotely. The Chinese students, they don't have an academic term, so they may be at home, they may be internshipping, so they have to figure out how do they call in and meet with the students here. And with 3 teams in different time zones, my schedule was from 7 in the morning till 8 at night. Trying to work with the students here at campus because they have classes they have to take. How do you balance this sort of scheduling out? Is it a challenge? It is, and you have to be flexible. So I appreciate Josh's comment about administrators wanting to be flexible about what it takes to do this. And then what we do is the last month of our semester, we bring the Chinese students here to campus. And they work the last month together, and then they present it to GM. So what's good about this program is the students are they're working together. They get to actually understand how to do teaming face-to-face. And that's actually critical, I think, for a first-time experience. With as challenging a problem as we're giving the students, if we started them off remotely, I think the probability of success would be much lower. Because they're having to learn their own cultures, they're having to learn the technology difficulties, they're having to learn the technical content difficulties, they're having to work with GM. And so we don't use Blue Jeans because GM has challenges using it. So the technologies we've worked with have flexed as well. So that ability for the students to be together makes a huge difference. And the one comment I'd have on this that when I do, I and Gail Horner, who's the director of MDP program, will go there to kick this thing off in September, and we'll tell the students this is going to be hard. And the students go, yeah. You know, and just the Chinese students speak very good English, the Joint Institute. The language of curriculum is English. So they think they've got it, but no, they really find out it's actually hard. And the Michigan students found that they were talking a whole lot more than the Chinese students were. But the Chinese students, the JI students, actually had a whole lot more technical expertise than our students because they were seniors. And it took them a little while to figure out the cultural aspects and why wasn't this working. But they made it work, and they did a great job. GM is incredibly happy. They hired one permanently, they hired another as an intern, and they've agreed to sponsor it this time. Yeah, so here's what I'm going to do is, I've got just a short, this is a synopsis of a presentation the students put together. It's choppy because I've edited it. It's not, they had a much better version of this. So let me just run through this and let them talk a little bit about it. Maybe.
Work with a bunch of people in different majors.
In the first semester, the whole 3 teams will be in the SJTU, Shanghai Jiaotong University.
Teams of 5.
In the last semester, we will go to NABO.
Mechanical engineering, computer science, electrical engineering.
live and knowledge learning classroom.
The Michigan students are paired up with JI students.
3 local students and 2 Michigan students.
Real automobile playful.
Real world scenario.
In NAPA, in Arbor, to finish our prototype.
You get to apply your classroom knowledge to real-world design.
The problem is headlight and taillight compensation.
Walking in the tail lamp.
Color vision is the problem, and it's ugly.
When it is around, it's unsightly to customers. It's our job to come up with a system that will mitigate or eliminate condensation from tail lamps or the buildup within tail lamps or headlamps.
My teammates are amazing. Good chemistry. We get along well with each other. My team is the best along the GMT. The pattern researchers.
It's fun to destroy lamp and see its inner structure. Reverse engineering.
Electronics design process.
Designs mechanical layout.
Just do it! Feel the air circulation.
That is what is the most unique about our solution, and I lost.
Why did you do this program? All different kinds of engineers. Exciting. This learning. Try something new. Design. That's a pretty cool project.
Interact with engineering on a global scale.
Work internationally.
Working with these Chinese students for a year.
I make lots of new friends, like Kiki.
We are all working really hard, so it gives you a great opportunity to bond with people.
Just having that close bond with your teammates.
I like to play with them.
A lot more knowledge about what's actually going on when you have a group of people who are working towards a common goal with you.
Got to experience each other's cultures a lot.
Interact with students in a more informal way than if we were just taking classes with them.
Allows you to know them pretty well.
So it helps you build relationships.
Gateway to meeting other people in the JI.
我们是朋友。
So the last thing I want to say on here that's actually important that was in there, by forcing them to earn a common grade, they had to be able to work together. There was a strong motivation for these people to figure out how to do it. So had we done it voluntarily, and the other students that went abroad that weren't involved in this program did not get the rich immersion experience that we had. So having that common goal and tying that together, I think makes a critical difference, and it's something I've learned by running this project.
Thank you, Greg. We have time for one question. Greg will be here afterwards for lunch, so if you would want to talk more, you can talk then. But any one particular question?
How do you fund the student travel back and forth? Is that a challenge? Oh, how do you fund the student travel back and forth? One of our challenges is that we can figure out how to fund students to go to, in my case, I work in Brazil. We cannot figure out how to fund Brazilian students to be able to come here. So it feels very much like our students are benefiting more than the Brazilian students from the actual travel because they're able to do it and the Brazilian students are usually not.
Sure. So this particular program, at least right now, we're the beneficiaries of one of Michigan's alumni who has been very successful in Chinese markets, and so is very supportive of having Michigan students go to China, and it actually set up a scholarship for us to do this. So those monies can be used to bring the Chinese students here, or help support some of that. And the Joint Institute actually was providing some support monies for that. They're not here for the semester, and that wouldn't make sense. But for that month here, in terms of their travel costs and staying here while in Ann Arbor, we're being supported that way. The other way, long time we'll do this, because this is probably industry supported. Right now, the GM is giving huge amounts of support via technical support. But when this program is run on campus, there's actually a financial commitment from companies as well, not to the tune of having the students be able to travel.
Quick question, yes.
Thank you. The students, they were in Shanghai from September to December. So how did they manage their other classes at University of Michigan?
So what they're doing is they're taking a full load of classes at the Joint Institute. So this is just one class that they're taking. This is a 4-credit-hour class, but the students are also taking other engineering courses and language and culture courses there, for which they can then transfer those courses back to their degree programs here. So this is one of the things that we work very hard at when our students go abroad, to be able to get those courses to come back to count towards their engineering degree.
Thank you. Thank you, Greg.
Yep.
So our, there we go. Our next speaker is Sue-Ann Crawford, and she is Associate Professor of History in the Residential College in LSNA. The course that she's working on is Inter-American Human Rights Law, History 401, that she's actually doing this semester, and has been doing for a while with students in Brazil. One of the really interesting things that I'm hoping that we'll hear about is how Sue-Ann does not, or in some of the classes, has not privileged the students by having the class be only in English. And so demonstrates a partnership and collaboration with her foreign partner in translating. She also does create opportunities for the students to work on projects outside of class, and so it is really building those collaborative relationships beyond the four walls of the classroom.
When Josh, just before Josh left, I said, Josh, I'm giving the exact same presentation. So we have very similar themes, which means that I think I can summarize a little bit, and I have a couple of clips that I can show you, because just the other day, some people from Latin American Studies came to our class because they wanted to make a little video about this class as part of their course. They have some course highlight videos that they like to do. So that was lucky that I thought, oh, so I can try to get some clips from their video to show you. I have one thing that Josh said that I want to repeat several times. I think the comments that I prepared repeat this point at least 4 or 5 times, and that is thank you to Philomena, to Todd, to Chris, to Monica for supporting these kinds of courses. It's been a really fabulous opportunity for me, as well as the students that have taken these courses with me. And it would not be possible without the LSNA technical support. It wouldn't be possible at all. So none of the class sessions would work if there weren't someone there that we could rely on. And then more importantly, this I didn't think was important, and I learned that it was extremely important, was that Todd and Philomena really insisted on meeting ahead of time, like a year ahead of time, and then again a semester ahead of time, to talk about things like, well, what are your goals? Why are you teaching this course collaboratively? Why this particular topic? And what do you expect to get out of the learning that you have across cultures? And those were really important conversations as we were planning the course and thinking about what we were doing in our interactions. So I want to really thank them for pushing us to think well ahead of time, not just about the technology, but first about the goals, objectives for why to do this, and then about how technology could help us do this, and also about what pitfalls to expect, so that we were flexible when those pitfalls came up to class, which they did in all of the classes. So I have, my initial motivation was pretty much the same as what we've heard before. That is, I had an experience as an exchange student in college. I was actually in Latin America for over 2 years as an exchange student, traveling, and then as an exchange student again. And then as a faculty member, I taught as a Fulbright faculty member twice in Brazil. And so had the experience of being a student in a different culture and being a professor in a different culture. And I was always trying to convince students to go abroad, and finding that it's difficult for them. Many just aren't able to manage it. They're not able to fit it into their schedule. They've got too much going on, and it's difficult. I think it's an incredible learning experience. I think all of us, most of us agree that the most important thing that we teach is beyond content of our particular classes, but how to engage other people, how to think critically about whatever problem you're addressing. And I think having to put yourself in a perspective that's very different from your own really
forces you to think critically, to look at problems from a perspective other than the one that you're bringing to the table. And I felt more and more at Michigan as our own student body has become in many ways less diverse over the last decade. It's all the more important, I think, for our students to have a diverse classroom experience. And one way to do that has been to take them virtually into another classroom, in my case in Brazil. So I also, in teaching in Brazil, one of the things that I noticed and that we would talk about as something that was humorous and that my students have found very interesting and sometimes funny is the cultural differences in styles and how is it that people approach a classroom, how is it they approach a classroom discussion. And so just to give an example, the first time I taught collaboratively, the first time I taught collaboratively, the way we did it was my students didn't speak Portuguese and the Brazilian students didn't speak English, and so the two professors translated. And so it was interesting that in my classroom, my students would have prepared whatever activity we prepared for the day. They would have prepared their readings. They would have something to say. I told them come with 2 points or 3 points or 2 questions and 1 point. And so they would wait their turn. They would raise their hands. They would say what they had to say. And then the Brazilian students, when they heard when it was sort of their turn, they would kind of explode into, especially if they were interested in the topic, it was about social movements. Many of them were activists and involved in social movements in Brazil. They would sort of explode into conversation. Everyone's interrupting each other. It felt like sort of, my family's Thanksgiving dinner, kind of arguing with each other, and you couldn't really, I couldn't make out. Luckily, we had decided that I was translating my students and my partner was translating her students. So, I couldn't make out what anybody was saying. And then and the professor was involved. And then, no, I don't think so. I think. And then at the end, she would sort of say, okay, hold on, let me tell them. And then she would sort of summarize. And then as she was summarizing, somebody who understood a little bit, and my students were just amazed at the difference. And it was very interesting over the course of the semester how they started to take on some of each other's characteristics when talking to each other. And so just that in and of itself, the kind of different ways that students establish rapport was, I think, an important part of the learning process. And we were talking about social movements, how you create social movements, how you create alliances and speak across group differences. And so experiencing it themselves was an important part of the learning process. So that was the second time that I tried this collaborative learning. So this semester is actually the 4th time I've done it. The first time I did it, we started out, after having had a meeting with Todd and Philomena, we started out modestly. We had lots of challenges, including time differences, and because it's the northern southern hemisphere, our daylight saving times moves us in opposite directions, and so we had to figure out how much overlap we would have, which changed throughout the semester, and work that into our plan. And what we decided to do was we each had our separate courses, and we met 6 times for an hour. And each time, because Todd and Philomena had asked us, what are you learning, what is this interaction going to add? We really thought about activities that made sense to discuss across cultures, where the perspective of students in Brazil and the perspective of students in US on that particular question would be especially interesting for both sides. So just to give an example, we talked about the Being Black at Michigan movement here at Michigan, and then a similar anti-racist movement at their university. We talked about coincidentally, we had a couple of students in each of our classes that had been involved in those movements, and so we were able to create discussions around that topic. And then we had another, which was looking at the histories of affirmative action and university diversity and inclusion policies. So the history of the thinking about that. And those were research topics where my students prepared by looking at sources that I'd given them. They gave many presentations. The Brazilian students did the same, and they presented and then had a conversation about differences in each of the places. And then at the end of that, we let them give their opinions. And it was really interesting because many of the Brazilian students had very recently benefited from affirmative action policies in Brazil, and so more than half of the class, the Brazilian classroom, were students who said, oh, I couldn't have come to the university if it hadn't been for these policies that had just been implemented a few years earlier. So that was really interesting, and those kinds of experiences were very particular to the group that we collaborated with. This was a university in Rio. It's a university that the Brazil Initiative at the International Institute created an agreement with, so we have a close relationship with them. Their history department is not as competitive as the University of Michigan. It's not an elite institution. It's a much more diverse institution. And so the differences in the students were really kind of palpable. Those students, most of them work as well as go to school full-time. Many of them live very far from the campus. They have to take buses, and it takes them a long time to get there. They don't have the same kind of academic background that our students have. In addition to not having the same culture of the same sort of concern with grades, the same kind of competitive culture that we have at the University of Michigan. And so it was very interesting that on the one hand, my students would come very well prepared. They'd have good presentations. They would have done the readings and have answers to questions about specific things in the readings. The Brazilian students came, not all of them, some of them were extremely well prepared also. They tended to come less prepared in terms of doing the specific assignment we asked them to do. On the other hand, they came really well prepared in terms of their willingness and their quickness in relating what we were talking about to events in their own lives. And also because many of them were involved in the kinds of movements we were learning about, they were especially eager to think and talk about the kind of contemporary applications of historical processes that we were talking about. So the other class, I said this is the fourth time I've done this. So the first time was with this university and the same professor who is in, she's the one behind the guy right there, Kayla Grinberg, who's a historian of slavery in Brazil. And so the first time we had 5 or 6 one-hour sessions together. The second time we were more ambitious. We created the class with more sessions together, but we did not try to do, and we also had we built on the assignments that really worked by giving students groups where they would online collaborate with one another, giving each other content. So the US students, the Brazilian students could usually understand enough English that they could read what the things and look at videos that the US students would find, and then the Brazilian students found content that had English subtitles, and they were sharing things, and it was really very dynamic. So their presentations were, I would tell my students, okay, you're preparing a 5-minute presentation, and no more than 5 minutes, and blah, blah, blah. And that never worked out because the Brazilian students would always sort of, interrupt, and they'd add something. So my lesson plans almost never really went the way I expected, but instead, usually there were pretty dynamic conversations. And the second time, we followed up with a trip, and this is all of my students with the Brazilian students in Rio. So we had a 2-week study trip where I took 10 students to Rio, and we had very intense activities for them while they were there. And the Brazilian students, whom they had gotten to know over the course of the semester, hosted them. And that was really quite remarkable. It was really quite wonderful for them to be received by these students who were so enthusiastic about them coming. And as I mentioned in my question in the last, for the last presentation, the thing that really, really nagged at me the entire time was that it was so unbalanced, that the Brazilian students were not able to have the same experience by coming here to the University of Michigan because they didn't have the funds to do that. So what I was able to do, though, was to invite 2 of the students who were really central to the course and very committed to the course, and who were 2 of the students who were activists, who were involved in student activist movements during that semester. The following year, for a course that I also did a Brazil segment, they were able to actually come. I was able to get funding to have them come as presenters, sort of as scholars. And that was very cool. They stayed for 2 weeks, and the students who had been hosted them, so that worked out really well. And the students, that was a freshman class, and they came and they presented and they participated in the class for the 2 weeks. So that was somewhat of a way to make it a little bit more even. And I was really glad that that worked out because the 2 classes were with the same professor, similar, the second one, an expanded version of the first. Worked out really well. Both of them, especially the second one, I haven't repeated those experiences because although they were invigorating, students loved it, I think the learning was tremendous, it was extraordinarily time consuming for me and for my partner in Brazil. So after the students, we packed them off, got them in their taxis to the airport, and we're just like, oh, it was very exhilarating, but also exhausting. So it was something that we sort of thought of, okay, we want to do it again, but let's think of a way that we can do it in a way that doesn't require so much of an effort outside of class on our part. So we're still working on that because we plan to do it next winter, not this winter, but next winter. The third, so that was 2 times, same professor, same sort of scheme. The third time was with a different professor from the same university. That time did not work very well. And much of the reason was because of the situation of economic crisis. There was a strike that went on at the university, and the professor I was working with was a different professor. He didn't have the same level of commitment that Caleb, who's also a very close friend of mine, so we talk all the time. I mean, so we have, that professor and I have good rapport, but he just wasn't as committed to the kind of preparation that it takes, that it really requires to make it work. And therefore, when we did get together, if the technology worked, things went pretty well, but often the technology just did not work. And so luckily it was the same semester that I had invited the students from the previous year, so that kind of compensated for our video conferencing not working. So then this semester, I'm doing a completely different course with a different professor in a different university. This is he's a federal judge and law professor at one of Brazil's most competitive, one of Brazil's best law schools. And so they're the same age as our undergraduate students because law is an undergraduate degree in Brazil. And so this class, and also the classes are, the class I taught before were about 20 in each class. This class is a little bit smaller. I've got 18 in my class, and there are 15 in the Brazilian class. And it's also a different topic. We, instead of doing sort of social movements, history of social movements and human rights, we're focusing on more legal aspects. So it's a history of the inter-American human rights system. So it's a much, much more structured class, and the presentations and preparation are much more structured as well. The disadvantages that I think you'll notice, and I have some clips, are that although the students are wonderful, and the students in Brazil are very, very dedicated because this is a class that is not required, and I actually don't think it really counts for anything for them. They're taking it because they're really interested in the subject matter and excited about this, being able to do this kind of interaction. So they're really terrific students. They've given a couple of and they all speak English. So that was another level of elitism. The positive side is they all speak English. My students were able to actually have the students do joint presentations, do joint work together outside of class that they're getting graded on as a group, and so that was all very positive. The kinds of formal presentations that the Brazilian professor wanted his students to do for us were really excellent, really very high level, very well done. But the disadvantage is that it's not a diverse group in terms of socioeconomic and racial identity. It's really mostly white and mostly middle class, upper middle class students, which is too bad. And I don't know how to bridge that gap because students who are able to speak English at that level and who are able to choose this kind of opportunity in Brazil tend to not be a diverse group of students. So there are real advantages and real disadvantages to this kind of decision. So, so what I'd like to do is show you a couple of clips. Monica, how much time do we have?
You have about 3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay, so I'll just show you one clip. This was a discussion. So I have one clip that shows you one of their presentations, and another that shows a discussion that we had on this same.
And grow within the development of a family that is structured normally and is appreciated in the social environment.
So I should explain that their presentation, what we asked them to do is to take a case that's gone before, that's been heard by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and enact it in some way in 15 minutes. And so this was their enactment of this case. And so the Brazilian student who's speaking, she represented the husband of a woman whose children were taken away from her because she had a lesbian relationship.
According to the proper traditional model.
Oops, sorry.
It was a tolerance response.
Yes, sir. You have no solid proof that your father was a better target for my daughters. And for the piece of your witness, for every person that said that my daughters were being bullied or discriminated against, there was a witness that said that they were not. They had been living with me before my partner joined us, and the environment was suitable at that time, and I knew that it was suitable after she started living with me and my daughters.
She did not discriminate against Ms. Adamo. The state analyzed the facts, the testimonies, and the proof, and then made a rational decision based on what was best for the children. That's all.
Going back to your notion of the heterosexual family, in regard to that reference, which article are you citing?
Well.
So their point being that she wasn't citing the article. But, so that was one of the presentations which we encouraged them to, one of the presentations, one of the requirements was that that their presentation be interactive and that they be debating rather than each and presenting their characters' points. And I'll just show you what this other one looks like to give you an idea of the kind of discussion. This was the same class. We were talking about violence against women, and the Brazilian students at the end of their presentation, they said, we have a question, because here in Brazil, we have a lot of issues with feeling vulnerable and feeling safe as women in personal relationships and even just out in the street. And we really want to know from the US women in the class, how do you feel? Is it the same? And so this was, it was very difficult to sort of corral that in because all of the women in the class wanted to talk, and they wanted to talk at length about their own personal experiences, and the Brazilians also. And so we had just heard from all of our students, and each of them had an experience of sexual harassment that they wanted to talk about. And then the Brazilian students, and so then I turned and said, okay, you guys.
But I really feel like only during this part we really especially see how much violence comes from men when they see a woman in a violence situation.
Also, men have a tendency to support each other. Like when you see your friend, your male friend, committing something kind of abuse, you try, at least we experience this here, they try to protect each other. And so as women, we have to protect each other as well. So I think that's a feeling that's growing in Brazil right now, that the bus is like someone wants to me.
So all my students have their hands up, but I also want to bring, and we have speakers, so I'm trying to corral them.
Mariana, is Mariana still there?
Yeah, I'm here. I will have my.
Oh, there you are. Great, yes. I don't know if you've been following our conversation.
So that was what we also did several times this semester, was we had speakers who came from a third place. So we videoed them in. So Mariana is a human rights lawyer who focuses on domestic violence, and she was coming in from Brasilia. So having the LSNA tech people made this possible, and it worked really well to be able to go back and forth. And but had I not had the tech people, we couldn't have done any of it, but particularly when it gets complicated. She also had a PowerPoint, and so we had 3 different things going on the screen, which makes it very dynamic, but also complex.
Great. Thank you so much, students. Our final speaker is Kelly Maxwell, and she's academic director for the program for intergroup relations. and is adjunct faculty with the National Center for Institutional Diversity in LSNA. And what's particularly interesting of having Kelly here to talk is that she is in the planning stage right now, and really wanted her to share a little bit about that, what she needs to think about, what she needs to include as she is preparing and designing a co-taught international course. And so she's going to be focusing primarily on that. So you'll have that range of what our faculty are going through.
All right. Thank you for having me. And Moni gave my confession right up front. I'm not yet doing a global course. But I also think one of the reasons I was asked to be here today is because I work with a program on intergroup relations, and so we are often working face-to-face on our campus, helping our students think about social identities, interacting across different groups, intercultural and intergroup communication, that sort of thing. So I'm going to be reflecting on some of the things that I've learned that I really have questions about how they will work in a different kind of class. So for full disclosure, about 10 years ago, we created and offered a course called Global Understandings, which was a video conferencing course where we would pair throughout the term with 3 different sites around kind of intercultural communication, intercultural development. That course has bounced around for a number of years, and it's now back with us in IGR. And so that's the course that I'm thinking about, kind of retooling the curriculum, probably not having as many video conferencing partners, and so that's kind of the context here. Okay, so when we do intergroup dialogue or dialogic kinds of classes here on our campus, we always start with guidelines for engaging together. How many of you use guidelines when you are teaching your courses? Great. Some of you are already familiar with this. That's terrific. So this is a way for, when we're face-to-face in a class, what are the community norms that we're going to set up? How are we going to talk together, knowing that even on campus, we don't necessarily agree, we have conflict, we have different communication styles, and how are we going to engage together in a productive way? So one of the questions I have is how to do this kind of guideline engagement together with a group somewhere else. Because in just a minute I'm going to be talking about these key dimensions of cultural difference. Some of these guidelines I think are really bounded to Western ways of communicating. So for example, challenge the idea and not the person, or speak your discomfort. Some of those are pretty standard guidelines that we might use in a classroom here at the University of Michigan. But if that's not normative to actually speak your discomfort, how can we have that really as a guideline, and how can we talk about that by establishing some norms for how we're going to talk together that can be mutually beneficial for everybody who is in this video conferencing experience. So just those are some questions that I'm thinking about. So when we engage here in a class on campus here, I might ask students, well, what is culture? And they think about all these different aspects of culture, and may come up with food and clothing and dance and etiquette, that sort of thing. But what we really recognize is that really only that top 10% of that iceberg is really visible in culture. And there's all this stuff underneath, like our family relationships, like concepts of time, like nonverbal communication, how leadership works, how we make decisions. All of that is underneath this iceberg. And we could be the Titanic, where we think the iceberg's over there, but really, it's spread way out and we hit it. So we talk in our classes on campus about how do we navigate these icebergs? How do we bring together all of these things that are under the surface so that we expose those, are talking about those in a really open way. And that, of course, is even heightened when we're talking with people that are truly in other cultural contexts. So those are, again, some things that I'm thinking about. How do I prepare my students for this reality, for really talking in meaningful ways, getting meaningful content, but recognizing that these things under the surface are happening. And one of the ways we do that is talking about key dimensions of cultural difference. This is the long time ago here at Hofstede's work that has been communicated over time. And there's lots of key dimensions of cultural difference, but I'm going to talk about 3, and I'm going to try to engage you in a little activity if you'll play along with me. So one of the key dimensions is concepts of self. And I'm presenting these here as a binary, but really we might think of them as a continuum. So some cultures, Hofstede and his colleagues really found is that are really individualistic. They have an I identity. People are thinking about individual goals. And then there's the other continuum, collectivistic goals. We think of we think of group goals, and so there's this continuum. What would you say U of M culture is typically like? Individualistic or collectivistic? What would you say? Individualistic, right? And we're embedded in a US culture that tends to be individualistic. So with the students, we unpack that, talk about different kinds of collectivistic and individualistic. But here's where I want you to play along with me. If you've got some note paper out, I just want you to draw a horizontal line. And if you have, think about individualistic on the left and collectivistic on the right. I just want you to mark a little X where you think your style falls. You, individually, where do you fall in this continuum of individualistic versus collectivistic? So hang on to that thought. Another dimension are concepts of time. So monochronic time, it's really based on the clock. We are on time, we have an appointment, got to be there. And then we have this polychronic time. It's very situational, it's approximate, it's flexible. And those two can really clash, because folks with monochronic time may think it's really rude for someone to just show up whenever they show up. And someone with a polychronic time may think, why are you so rigid? It's very inflexible to have to be at this very specific time. So again, draw another line. We've got monochronic on one end, polychronic on the other end. And I want you to just mark an X where you think you fit along that timeline continuum. Now at U of M, we might think of ourselves as very monochronic, but we've got this notion of Michigan time, right? So, we've adapted a little bit, or we have this polychronic time thing going on just a little bit. And then the last one I want to talk about, and there are others, is power distance. So low power distance is where, we're more equal colleagues. We work together. Subordinates or employees might expect consultation in decision making. We might call each other by our first names. Our professors, we might call our professors by our first names, that sort of thing. In some cultures, there's high power distance, where there's a very specific hierarchy. Seniority and rank is very important. And people who are employees or people who are our students expect direction rather than consultation. And so again, if you're working in a group, like in these engineering groups that Greg was talking about, if you've got different power distance, what is going to happen when the group comes together? So we have to be aware that these things are mixed in, and not just judge that other person. Why don't they speak up? Why don't they call me by my first name? Whatever the situation is, we have to understand where this comes from. So last one, put another line. You've got low power distance on the left, high power distance on the right. Where do you fall? Mark an X on that line. Now I think I have enough time to do this. I just want you to notice your lines and the 3 marks that you made for time and individualistic, collectivistic, and now power distance. And just turn to a partner and talk about, did those line up for you? Why do you think that is? Why do you think it maybe was across the board? You had little marks in different places. How do your identities, your social identities, such as your race or ethnicity, or your nationality, or your gender, or your religion, how do you think those may have impacted where you put that line? So go ahead and just talk for a minute with your partner. Okay, find out the partner quickly.
My background is like from the kind of our identity. For the self, we have our group identity, so more on the right side, and on the time,
All right, I'll have you come on back to the front of the room. I just wanted to give you an example. Of the kind of experiential exercise or engaged learning exercise that I might use in a class to have students be thinking about these issues. So in the program on intergroup relations, these are some of the most important skills and competencies that we think and have outlined as particularly important when we're working effectively across intercultural relationships. Sometimes students come expecting to learn about that other group. I really want to learn about, people from another culture. The most important thing is the self-awareness, because you can't learn about that other group unless you know about your own group and you know about yourself, your own biases, your own styles, your own experiences. So that's why in these key elements of key dimensions of cultural development, we've talked not only about what other groups may experience and have, but our own group too, so that we can kind of situate ourselves along this continuum as well. Empathy is another piece. Now this is one of my big question areas. So we teach listening, active listening skills. We teach asking questions and inquiry. Certainly those things can be done on video conferencing for sure. But how do we use those nonverbals that normally in a class when you're face to face, it's a lot easier. How do I pick up on an empathic situation? I'm wondering, Sue Ann, when you were talking about the women's experiences around, was it domestic violence or just sexual harassment? Sexual harassment. I bet there was a lot of connection between the people that were talking across the video link and you know, how are they able to make that empathy connection as well? So that's something that I'm thinking about in continuing to develop this class. Certainly tolerance for ambiguity. Students have to have that, especially in this kind of class, because of the technology things that can happen, but also in realizing that the ways that we communicate are very different. You know, our students are really prepared, as you were talking about, and then the students from somewhere else are really engaged in the topic from a really different kind of point of view. So that ambiguity, our students need that, and that flexibility. They need to be curious. They also have to have patience for something that is different from their own experience. Ability to listen to others, conflict resolution skills, and interest in continuous learning. Those are all things that we would probably work on individually with our students before engaging, and then continuing to have that engagement across the video conferencing link. But you know, these are all just things I'm thinking about. And then finally, so these questions for consideration, and I've already raised a number of them. So how do you use dialogic techniques across technology through video conferencing? How do we set up these conditions for dialogue that I'm very used to doing face-to-face in the same room, but looks very different and may feel very different across video conferencing? Again, the nonverbals and the empathy I already mentioned, and deepening conversations across space and time. So not just a presentational thing, but how can we dig deeper? And I just don't know how to do it yet. So I was really pleased to listen to my colleagues on the panel, because I think that really gave me some ideas and help. Time zones, the technological malfunctions, I'm concerned about that. I have questions about just those logistics. And then, you know, what are really the adjustments to my teaching style? So when I'm in the class, done this for 18 years, really, really comfortable. And now how does that approach change when I am working with students across the world through a video conferencing link? So those are my questions. Those are my ideas to present to you to give you some food for thought. And I welcome interaction and questions and your responses too.
Well, thank you, Kelly. Really appreciate your Are there questions for Kelly?
Yes. The course, how long is, oh, sorry. I didn't get a sense of what kind of course you envision. So is it a semester-long course? And
It is. It's a 3-credit semester-long course. At least that's what it has been in the past, and we do intend to continue it in that way. The content really is about building intercultural skills, building intercultural knowledge. So it's not a particular disciplinary content focus. It's more on skills and capacity building for students. And as I said in the past, we have had 3 different other sites across the world, which we may continue to do, but I'm just thinking, gosh, that's an awful lot of, you know, reintroducing each time, and so, yeah.
Diana.
Hey, Kelly, thank you. I'm wondering, yours particularly, but also the other panelists, are often sort of single channel communications, and I know sometimes students in the room, they have their technology, they might be texting side channel or back channel, and sort of the comment about, or the goal of empathy and making those interpersonal relationships. I'm wondering to what extent there's that, you're going to feel comfortable with that ambiguity of allowing multiple channels and things to not be as structured.
Yeah. Yeah, when we did this 10 years ago, I mean, the technology was a lot different, but there was a chat component. I think it's probably way more sophisticated now to have some of that back channel conversation, even as there's the video conferencing, the formal communication. So I think that will be an important consideration. How do we do that? And really leverage that as a way for students to have maybe some one-on-one experience with each other.
Terrific. Well, we'll have more time over lunch. Let me just, there are a couple of things that I want to just call out to you as you proceed through the day and as you start thinking about what type of projects you might do or how to implement that. First is that there is a handout that hopefully you might have picked up. It has, it's engaging the world from your classroom. It has a whole variety of resources on there. And it has contact information for both staff at the Language Resource Center as well as LSA Instructional Support Services. I want to make sure that everybody is aware that University of Michigan has a license where your students can also use Blue Jeans. So if you wanted to have them do a homework assignment and connect with somebody over the weekend, that they can do that from their own devices. It really has really expanded the opportunities that students can connect with others around the world. Does not necessarily, or even the United States, does not have to necessarily be just in that classroom. So it's a nice reminder of that. The other thing that I'd like to do is make sure to put in a plug that if you're thinking about doing a class like this, but you're not quite sure where that might be in your department or in your school or college, if you're teaching in an LS&A classroom, we will support you regardless of where you come from. We welcome everybody, we support everybody. We really love to try to make sure that people are able to do this. And if you're interested in trying to find out how you can get your class from another school or college into an LS&A space, you can connect with me. Instructional Support Services works closely with the registrar's office to try to help coordinate all of that. Similarly, if you're balancing issues of time zones and starts of the semester, the more time we can spend on that administrative side, that's where I can help. Todd and Philomena and their colleagues from the 2 units are also available for consultation at any time, so don't hesitate to contact them. Funding opportunities. A lot of times there are funding opportunities within your own schools, but I also want to make sure that you think about CRLT funding, that's available. Your International Institute is available, has funding often to explore these types of things. And certainly if you're in LS&A, Instructional Support Services also has funding. And we're looking for very creative ways that we can really help you engage with your students. If there is anything else that you have questions about, please grab any one of the people who are helping organize this. And Todd and Philomena just stepped out. So when they come back, please thank them for all of their work. And I'll let you all get to your lunch. So thank you so much.